Welcome to a short lecturette on the readings for class Learning Reconsidered and Learning Reconsidered II. When we think historically and we use the reflexive model that we talked about at the beginning of the semester about when these documents were released, there was a question of where student affairs professionals belonged in the greater scheme of student learning and if they belonged at all. During this time, influential works such as Greater Expectations, The Student Learning Imperative, Principles of Good Practice, at NASPA Professional Competencies, Professional Standards for College and University Career Services, and Powerful Partnerships, A Shared Responsibility for Learning. These all developed and explored the idea that learning was a responsibility that was shared between academic faculty and student affairs professionals. These documents were integral in positioning student affairs professionals as educators. And these also helped to develop a new definition about learning, and that was as the integration of academic learning and student development. These particular documents emphasize the broad scope in which learning occurs, both inside and outside the classroom. And it also called upon campus educators to collaborate, be more collaborative in the development of student learning outcomes, the assessment of those student learning outcomes, and the documentation of those student learning outcomes. So, translating these specific concepts that we're talking about in these documents was a little bit more challenging because while student affairs professionals acknowledged and embraced their role as educators, and a lot of us were, really excited about it. We're educators outside the classroom. We had to discover and test ways of applying these ideas and learning and how we're going to learn or think about learning in a practical and measurable way. Learning Reconsidered proposed several definitive statements and also directives, and they focused these on best practices for determining student learning. All campus resources should be used in the transformative education of the whole student and provided a practical framework for making the whole campus a learning community. Second, it defined learning as multicentric, a holistic process rooted in meaning making that integrates academic learning and student development. They definitively stated that we can and should consider the whole campus a learning community, and that colleges and universities of all types should utilize all of their resources to support the transformative education of every student. Additionally, as they're making these statements, they're putting this big umbrella over top of education that says powerful learning transforms how students see themselves in the world. And this is where you're going to see a lot of replication in university mission statements and vision statements about transformative and powerful learning and what that means as far as achieving that as a long-term learning outcome for students through the college process. When they talk about some best practices or thought processes for how directives and what can happen from these documents, they stated that all educators were accountable for developing and assessing student learning outcomes. And they talked about the examination of desired outcomes must occur at every level of the institution, starting at the university mission and vision, and then going to specific programs and activities. So, how do we do this? What is the process by how we use this? So Learning Reconsidered 2 was a follow-up to Learning Reconsidered, and it provided a blueprint for action that supported the intentional development of institutional learning outcomes or student learning outcomes before the creation of programs and interventions. So here you're seeing the development of student learning outcomes as the first part in the process of activities and programming and learning. So you develop the student learning outcomes at the beginning, and this is considered the integral part of fostering student learning. Next, you're going to begin to structure learning activities and programs outside or in collaboration with the classroom. As you think about the programs that you have been engaged in as a student, Did you feel like there was a purpose to the program, or did it feel like learning was an afterthought? And so that's really getting at the process here. Next, you're going to determine how you will assess your program or activity. Are you going to use electronic means? Are you going to use paper? I like to use Poll Everywhere when I'm doing a presentation so I can gauge where the audience is as far as participation level. Will you do a debrief after the activity? How will you focus on specific outcomes? Next, you're going to go ahead and collect your data, however you're going to do that. Then you're going to generate an action plan. Why do we do this? Well, why do we do the programming and activities in the first place, right? And the answer is not to keep students from drinking when they're not in class, although that could be an added benefit. This is where you ask yourself, what will you do with your assessment, and how will it propel new or other learning activities and programs? And then essentially we say, what was the point? How will you use this new or confirmed information about student learning to inform future practices and, as you know, future activities? So Learning Reconsidered II examined institutional mission and how learning outcomes can be used to support transition toward a student-centered or learner-centered environment that allowed for a broader understanding. Focused toward transformative learning and embracing the engagement of learners as whole people. So this sort of language of whole people and this language of holistic learning comes out of Learning Reconsidered and Learning Reconsidered II. And so when we're using this language of holistic learning, the whole person, educating the whole person, it really positions student affairs professionals as educators outside of the classroom. As you remember, when Cedarburg came to class this past Monday and talked about the 98%, 2% rule, that 98% of learning is going on outside the classroom, colleges and universities were now given directives to assess that learning outside the classroom, and a lot of the discussion in Learning Reconsidered II was how to do that. So I want you to take a moment and think about what kind of learning should be happening through the office that you work in now, an assistantship you have now or had, or in an office you previously worked in. For example, in a student conduct office, for example, a student should learn about their rights and responsibilities as a university student, about the code of student life, expectations for the university community for that student, and hopefully what we're hoping they'll learn is how their choices and actions impact the greater community. Then think about how that learning outcome fits into the greater picture of the mission and vision of the larger university. Does the program, activity, class, whatever, fit, for instance, into the UNCW 8 learning goals? These are the UNCW 8 learning goals, and most syllabi that you'll see tie into this in some way. So, for example, if we're going to use student conduct, we'll say it could definitely fit into global citizenship, and it could most likely be fitting into, foundational knowledge as far as expectations for living in a community. So then, when we talk about student learning outcomes, one of my favorite resources for how to write student learning outcomes is this little publication from the University of South Carolina. It's the National, and also the National Resource Center for First Year Experience and Students in Transition. It's not a very clear picture, but basically what it does is it tells you, writing student learning outcomes doesn't need to be, excessively challenging, but what it can do is, one, it should tell you who, two, it should tell you, what someone or what the object person will be able to do, and then thirdly, why that's specific to your office and why that's a learning outcome that's coming out of your office. So here's some examples. As you'll see, there are 3 different ones here, and what I'm going to focus on is this residential hall one here, where it says resident students will be able to resolve interpersonal conflicts in the residence hall. And so you have your who, resident students, as opposed to off-campus students. And then you have your will be able, this is what they're going to be able to do, resolve interpersonal conflicts, and then how it impacts the office or how it comes from the office. So in the residence hall. And that seems simplistic, but that can be a student learning outcome for multiple programs that are already in place, and also for creating new learning outcome or new programming around this learning outcome. So those are just some examples. So as educators, we create learning through activities and programs. This is what we just talked about. The important part of these documents is that we talk about doing it with intentionality. Learning should not be an afterthought that we just slap some custom learning outcomes on and pat ourselves on the back and say what a good job we did. The focus is on being intentional with our programming, creating student learning outcomes, and then creating the program. So something I wanted to go over quickly is assessment methods. I've heard a couple of you talk about student apathy towards surveys, and there are different kinds of assessment and different kinds of techniques for assessment. Each activity or program needs to apply that method that is most appropriate. There's two different kinds of assessment, and one is formative assessment and the other is summative assessment. And formative assessment techniques are monitoring the student learning during the learning process. That's what you need to remember. The summative assessment, it focuses on the student learning process and evaluating the student learning process that occurs at the end of an instructional unit, a course, or the entire collegiate learning experience. So those are the two different kinds. So when you're focusing on different techniques and assessment methods, you have direct and indirect assessment that I go over here, but you also have different techniques for these. And the different techniques are, the informal techniques, which are, written reflections. A lot of instructors like to do those minute papers. There's polls and surveys to talk about, how students are experiencing the class. There's checks for understanding, pre-test, post-test, things like that. And then wrappers. And wrappers are tests, lectures, homework, anything that can prove whether or not a student is grasping the skill that you're going over in class or online. And then you have formal techniques, and these can be in-class activities, these can be quizzes, these can be online assessments, and those formal techniques are all focusing on, the formative assessment and figuring out during the learning process. So the summative assessment, or evaluating the entire learning process, or more focused on, the learning outcomes, we're looking at large-scale assessment like exams, papers, projects, presentations, portfolios, lots of P's basically. And that's what you're going to see with final thesis, final projects, end of major papers, presentations defending findings, and of course for education majors and others, portfolios, a collection of your works. So what I want you to take away from this is that, assessment help is available to you, and it's expected of you as a student affairs professional. If you're an educator, how are you going to assess the learning outcomes? And so these are some of the documents that are available to you as far as best practices, and I encourage you to use them in order to develop your own student learning outcomes. So what do we do with this? So I encourage you to develop student learning outcome for your assistantship or a proposed program. And 2, I want you to determine if these student learning outcomes are congruent with your office or assistantship's mission and vision. And of course, largely, are they also congruent with the university? And then finally, talk with your program director or supervisor about how you can contribute to assessment where you're working now. Because you want to roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty and really start practicing. Once you get in the practice of doing assessment, it's going to come natural to you, and you're going to start, doing that model that they're hoping that we're doing at the beginning. So that's Learning Reconsidered and Learning Reconsidered II. And I hope you have a great holiday.